At my daughter-in-law's birthday party, my son publicly humiliated me. He demanded I sign over my $900,000 home so his wife could live like she deserves. When I refused, he pushed me in front of everyone. That night, I made a decision that changed everything. Before I tell you what happened next, please like this video, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. I'm 73 years old. For 47 years, I worked double shifts at the hospital, nights bleeding into days, my hands raw from sanitizer, my feet swollen in those white shoes that never seemed white enough. When Harold died 5 years ago, my heart shattered into pieces so small I'm still finding fragments in the corners of my chest when I breathe too deep. But I kept working. I kept fighting. Because that house, my house, was everything we built together, everything we dreamed of, everything we sacrificed for. $900,000. That's what the appraisers said it was worth last month. But numbers can't capture what lives in those walls. The kitchen where Harold and I danced on Sunday mornings while coffee percolated, where I taught my son to scramble eggs when he was 8, where I held him when his first girlfriend broke his heart. The living room where we opened Christmas presents for 30 years, where Harold proposed on one knee by the fireplace, where I read bedtime stories until my voice was hoarse. The master bedroom where my son took his first steps, where Harold and I whispered our dreams in the dark, where I held his hand as cancer stole his breath away. That house isn't just property. It's my life's work. Every double shift paid for another mortgage payment. Every missed holiday, every aching back, every time I chose work over rest, it all went into those walls, those floors, that roof that kept us safe. And now they wanted me to just give it away. Like it meant nothing. Like I meant nothing. The morning of her birthday party, I was up before dawn. My arthritic hands kneaded dough for her favorite lemon cake, the recipe Harold's mother taught me when I was just a girl trying to win over my future family. I arranged fresh flowers, peonies, and roses from my own garden, the one I've tended for 23 years. I polished the crystal chandelier Harold surprised me with for our anniversary, each piece catching the morning light like tears of joy. I folded cloth napkins into perfect triangles, set out the good china we only used for special occasions, lit vanilla candles that filled the house with warmth. Today would be different, I told myself as I applied lipstick with trembling fingers. Today I would be the mother-in-law she couldn't help but love. Today we would finally connect. Today would heal the growing distance I felt every time we were in the same room, the way her eyes seemed to catalog my possessions instead of meeting mine, the way conversations died when I entered the room. But when she called that morning, her voice had an edge that made my stomach clench. "Be ready," she said, her tone clipped and businesslike. Things changed today. When I asked what she meant, she just laughed, not the warm laugh I'd hoped to hear more of, but something cold and sharp. "You'll see, Mom. You'll see." My son's voice was distant when he confirmed they'd be there at 2. Usually he'd chat, ask about my garden or the book I was reading. But today, his words felt rehearsed, hollow. I pushed down the unease crawling up my throat. It was just nerves, I told myself. Party planning always made me anxious. When they arrived, she swept in wearing a designer dress I recognized from a magazine, something that cost more than my monthly Social Security check. Her eyes didn't meet mine as she kissed my cheek, but I caught them flickering across the crown molding, the hardwood floors, the vintage fixtures Harold and I had restored ourselves. She moved through my home like an appraiser, and something cold settled in my chest. My son's smile felt forced, not reaching his eyes the way it used to when he was proud of something. He used to look at this house with such love, remembering his childhood here, the tree fort Harold built in the backyard, the basement where he practiced guitar until the neighbors complained. Now he looked around like he was seeing it for the first time, or maybe seeing it the way she did. As guests arrived, they praised everything, the flowers, the food, the beautiful house. But she intercepted every compliment like a volleyball player diving for a spike. When Mrs. Patterson from next door admired the antique sideboard, she laughed and said, "Yes, it's lovely, but you know how these old pieces require so much maintenance. Young couples really need more practical furniture." When my book club friend mentioned how spacious the rooms were, she sighed dramatically. Sometimes space can feel overwhelming though, can't it? Especially as we get older. Don't you think young families really need this kind of room to grow? Each comment felt like a pinprick, but I smiled and nodded, playing the gracious hostess even as my heart began to pound. There was a pattern here, a script being followed, and I was the only one who didn't have the lines. When it came time for the cake, I lit the candles with shaking hands. Before she could blow them out, she stood and raised her wine glass. "I want to thank everyone for coming, and especially thank Mom for hosting in this beautiful, spacious home." The pause that followed felt like a held breath. You know, it's interesting how we hold on to things as we age, isn't it? Sometimes what we think is precious becomes a burden we don't even realize we're carrying. My son nodded solemnly, like she'd said something profound instead of something that felt like a knife between my ribs. "Mom's always been generous," he said, his voice carrying an odd emphasis. "But there's a difference between giving and sharing, isn't there? Sharing is about family. Sharing is about making sure everyone has what they need." The room felt suddenly airless. I gripped the back of my chair, my knuckles white against the wood Harold had sanded and stained himself. The guest shifted uncomfortably, sensing something beneath the surface, but not understanding what. Then she said it. The words that changed everything. "Mom, we think it's time you downsize. This house is too much for you to maintain alone. We've already talked to some professionals about making the transition as smooth as possible." The room went silent except for the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. Transition. Like I was dying. Like I was already gone and they were just waiting for the funeral to move in. "We want to help you," my son added, his voice gentle but firm. "We want to take care of you. But we also want to make sure this beautiful home is being used by people who can really appreciate it, really make the most of it." I found my voice, though it came out smaller than I intended. "This is my home. Harold and I built this life together. I'm not ready to leave." Her laugh was like glass breaking. "Ready? Oh, Mom. Sometimes we have to do things we're not ready for. Sometimes other people know what's best for us better than we do ourselves." I excused myself to the kitchen, my hands shaking as I gripped the counter where I'd prepared thousands of meals, where Harold used to read me the morning news while I cooked his eggs. They followed me, and suddenly the space felt too small, too crowded with their expectations and my resistance. "You're not thinking clearly," she said, her voice taking on a patronizing tone I'd heard her use with slow waiters and customer service representatives. "We're trying to protect you from yourself. This house is falling apart, and you're too proud to see it. We'll make sure you're comfortable somewhere more appropriate." More appropriate? The words came out sharper than I intended. "This is my home. These are my memories. My husband died in the bedroom upstairs. My son took his first steps in the living room. I won't sign anything. I won't leave." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. My son's face hardened in a way I'd never seen before, and for a moment, I didn't recognize the boy I'd raised, the man I'd sacrificed everything for. When we returned to the living room, she took control of the narrative with the skill of a politician. "We're worried about Mom," she announced to the guests, her voice heavy with manufactured concern. "She's becoming increasingly isolated, increasingly resistant to help. We think the house is becoming too much for her, but she's too proud to admit it. She deserves better than this," my son added, gesturing around the room like it was a hovel instead of the home I'd poured my soul into. "She deserves to live somewhere where she doesn't have to worry about maintenance and upkeep. She deserves more than you're giving yourself, Mom." Those words. She deserves more than you. Like I was holding her back. Like I was the problem. Like my existence in my own home was somehow depriving her of something that was rightfully hers. The guests murmured agreement, their expressions sympathetic, but directed at her, not me. I was being reframed in real time, transformed from generous hostess to stubborn old woman, from beloved neighbor to difficult relative who needed to be managed. When I stood to defend myself, to explain that this was my home and I had every right to stay, my son's face twisted with frustration. "Why are you being so selfish?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Why can't you think about anyone but yourself for once?" Selfish. The word hit me like a physical blow. 47 years of double shifts. 40 years of marriage where I put Harold's dreams before my own. 20 years of putting my son's needs first, of going without so he could have everything he wanted. And I was selfish for wanting to keep the home I'd earned with my own sweat and sacrifice. "She needs space to grow," he continued, his voice getting louder, more aggressive. "She needs room for her art, for her projects. She needs a home that reflects who she is, not some museum to your past." "This isn't a museum," I said, my voice breaking. "This is my life. This is where I belong." That's when he pushed me. Not hard enough to really hurt, but hard enough to send me stumbling backward, hard enough to make me catch myself against the wall, hard enough for every person in that room to see that my own son had put his hands on me in anger. The silence that followed was deafening. Forks stopped midway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence. 20 pairs of eyes watched as I straightened myself against the wall, my face burning with shame and shock and a pain that went deeper than any physical injury. No one moved to help me. No one asked if I was okay. They just stared, and in their stares, I saw judgment, not of him for pushing his elderly mother, but of me for being the kind of person who gets pushed. For being difficult. For being in the way. I stood there against my own wall in my own home, surrounded by people eating my food off my dishes, and I had never felt more alone. That night, after they all left, I cleaned up in silence. The house felt different now, contaminated somehow by what had happened. I washed dishes with mechanical precision, put away chairs, swept crumbs from the floor where my son had pushed me. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly in the emptiness, each second marking time I couldn't get back, innocence I couldn't restore. At 3 a.m, I pulled out the suitcase Harold and I had used for our honeymoon. My hands didn't shake as I packed. Just enough clothes for a week, my medications, the few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to my mother. I left everything else exactly as it was. The dishes in the sink. The flowers on the table. The leftover cake in the refrigerator. At 5 a.m, I called a taxi. As we pulled away from the house, I didn't look back. I couldn't bear to see it shrinking in the distance, couldn't bear to acknowledge that I might never see it the same way again. My sister Margaret lived 3 hours away in a small coastal town where the air smelled like salt and possibility. When I showed up on her doorstep with my single suitcase, she didn't ask questions. She just held me while I cried, the first tears I'd allowed myself since Harold died, tears that tasted like grief and rage and something that might have been relief. "A son shares my blood," I told her as we sat on her porch watching the waves crash against the rocks. "But love is proven by protection, not possession. Love doesn't push. Love doesn't demand. Love doesn't humiliate." She nodded, understanding in the way only sisters can. "You did the right thing," she said. "You saved yourself." But they weren't done with me yet. Within hours of my departure, her social media lit up with a carefully crafted post, concerned about family member experiencing confusion and making unsafe decisions. "We're working to ensure she gets the care and support she needs. Please keep us in your thoughts during this difficult time." The comments poured in. People I'd known for years, neighbors I'd helped through emergencies, friends from church, all expressing sympathy for my son and his wife, all buying into the narrative that I was unwell, that I was the problem, that they were the victims of my stubbornness and confusion. So sad when elderly people become paranoid. You're doing the right thing. Sometimes we have to make hard choices. She's lucky to have you looking out for her interests. Looking out for my interests by taking my house. Caring for me by pushing me. Protecting me by humiliating me in front of my friends. The gaslighting was so complete, so professionally executed, that for a moment I almost believed it myself. Maybe I was confused. Maybe I was being difficult. Maybe they really did know what was best for me. But Margaret had been collecting evidence. For months, she'd been saving screenshots of social media posts, recording phone conversations where legally possible, documenting dates and times and patterns. She'd watched my son's behavior change, watched his wife's influence grow, watched my confidence erode under their constant pressure. "Look at this," she said, spreading papers across her kitchen table like a detective solving a case. "Look at the pattern. Look at how systematic this has been." Text messages where she criticized my housekeeping, my cooking, my appearance. Photos I didn't remember taking that made my home look cluttered and unkempt. Conversations where she'd mentioned my declining memory to neighbors, setting up the narrative that I was becoming incompetent. "She's been building a case," Margaret said, her voice grim. "She's been creating evidence that you're unfit to live independently. This wasn't sudden, honey. This was planned." The realization hit me like a wave of ice water. This wasn't about my well-being. This wasn't about family. This was about a $900,000 house and a woman who had decided she deserved it more than I did. Margaret had found a lawyer who specialized in elder abuse and illegal property occupation. Sarah Chin was younger than my son but spoke with the authority of someone who'd seen this pattern before, who understood that predators don't always look like strangers in dark alleys. "This is more common than you'd think," she said as we sat in her office overlooking the bay. "Adult children who view their parents' assets as their inheritance, who feel entitled to claim those assets while the parent is still alive. And when they marry someone with the same mindset, the pressure becomes overwhelming." She explained the charges we could file: illegal occupation of property, elder abuse, harassment, intimidation. She outlined remedies, restraining orders, eviction notices, documentation requirements. But most importantly, she gave me back something I'd lost: the knowledge that I had rights, that I had power, that I wasn't crazy or selfish or confused. "Document everything," she said. "Keep records. Stay calm. And never face them alone again." As we prepared our case, Sarah's investigator did some digging into my daughter-in-law's past. What he found made my blood run cold. This wasn't her first time. 2 previous relationships, both with older men who had significant assets. Both relationships had ended with property transfers, changed wills, mysterious gifts that left the men with significantly less than they'd started with. "Look at the pattern," Sarah said, spreading police reports and court documents across her desk. "Seduce, isolate, reframe, extract." She identifies vulnerable targets, usually through work or social connections. She builds trust, then systematically undermines their confidence and support systems. She creates situations where they feel dependent on her, then gradually escalates demands until they comply. My son wasn't the predator. He was another victim, caught in the web of someone who had studied manipulation like a language, who understood exactly how to find the pressure points in a family and push until something broke. But knowing that didn't make his actions forgivable. Being manipulated doesn't excuse pushing your elderly mother. Being influenced doesn't justify public humiliation. At some point, we all have to choose between what's easy and what's right, and he had chosen wrong. Sarah suggested a controlled meeting, neutral location, witnesses, recording devices where legally permitted. "Let them talk," she advised. "Let them explain themselves. People like this are often overconfident. They've gotten away with it before, so they assume they always will." The meeting was set for a conference room at Sarah's office. When they walked in, I almost didn't recognize my son. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of what he'd done. She looked exactly the same, beautiful, confident, completely unaware that the ground was shifting beneath her feet. "Mom," he started, his voice carefully modulated. "We're glad you're here. We want to work this out. We want what's best for everyone." Sarah pressed record on the device sitting openly on the table. "Please, speak freely," she said. We want to understand your position. And they did speak freely. For 45 minutes, they laid out their case with the confidence of people who had never been challenged, never been held accountable. They talked about my declining capacity, my unsafe living conditions, their responsibility to protect me from my own poor judgment. She can't maintain that house anymore, she said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone I'd heard in my kitchen. It's too much for someone her age. She's being stubborn and unrealistic. We're trying to help her transition to something more appropriate, my son added. Something that makes more sense for her current needs. And what about your needs? Sarah asked quietly. The questions seemed to catch them off guard. They exchanged glances, and I saw something flicker in my son's eyes, doubt, maybe, or the first stirring of awareness that they were being recorded, that their words had consequences. Well, obviously we'd like to start a family, she said finally. And that house is perfect for children. It has a big backyard, good schools nearby. It makes sense for the property to be used by people who can really make the most of it. So you want her to give you the house so you can start a family there? Give is such a harsh word, she said, her voice becoming defensive. We're talking about family planning. We're talking about making sure resources are distributed fairly. She's had her turn in that house. Now it's time for the next generation. Sarah pulled out a manila folder and placed it on the table. I see. And this wouldn't be the first time you've been involved in this kind of family planning, would it? The color drained from her face as Sarah spread out the documents. Police reports, court filings, property records showing a clear pattern of relationships that ended with significant financial gain. I don't know what you're implying, she said, but her voice had lost its confident edge. I'm not implying anything, Sarah replied calmly. I'm stating facts. You've been involved in similar situations before. Older partners, property transfers, relationships that end when the assets have been transferred. My son stared at the documents, his face cycling through confusion, realization, and finally horror. What is this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Your wife's history, Sarah said simply. Did you know about the restraining order from 2019? The elder abuse charges that were dropped when the victim died before trial? The civil suit from 2021 that was settled out of court. He looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time, and maybe he was. The careful construction of their relationship, the way she'd isolated him from his friends, the gradual erosion of his relationship with me, it was all part of a pattern he was finally beginning to see. That's not what this is, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah pulled out another folder. This is documentation of your current illegal occupation of your mother's property. She never gave you permission to live there. She never signed any documents transferring ownership. You moved in after she left, changed the locks, and have been living there without her consent for 6 weeks. We were protecting the property, she said quickly. Someone had to make sure it was secure. By changing the locks without the owner's permission? By posting on social media that you were safeguarding property that doesn't belong to you. The evidence kept mounting. Screenshots of social media posts, witness statements from neighbors who had seen them moving furniture and making changes, documentation of my son using my address to change his voter registration and update his driver's license. You've been planning this, Sarah continued, her voice never rising but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. You've been systematically undermining Mrs. Harrison's confidence, isolating her from her support system, and creating a narrative that she's incompetent so you could justify taking her property. That's not true, my son said, but he was looking at his wife with growing suspicion. Isn't it? Sarah pulled out the final piece of evidence, the recording from the party, enhanced and cleaned up so every word was crystal clear. My son's voice, sharp with frustration. Why are you being so selfish? Why can't you think about anyone but yourself for once? Her voice, cold and calculating. She needs space to grow. She needs room for her art, for her projects. She needs a home that reflects who she is. And then the sound that made my son flinch, the thud of his hands against my body, the scrape of my shoes against the floor as I caught myself against the wall. You pushed her, Sarah said simply. You physically assaulted a 73-year-old woman because she wouldn't give you her house. My son's face crumpled. For a moment, he looked like the little boy who used to cry when he accidentally stepped on insects, the teenager who called me from college just to hear my voice, the young man who held my hand at Harold's funeral and promised he'd always take care of me. Mom, he whispered, I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you. But she wasn't done fighting. This is ridiculous, she snapped, her mask finally slipping completely. She's an old woman living alone in a house worth almost $1 million. We're young, we're starting our lives, we have plans and dreams and futures ahead of us. She's just sitting there like a dog in a manger, hoarding resources she can't even properly use anymore. The silence that followed was profound. Even her own lawyer looked uncomfortable as the full extent of her entitlement filled the room like toxic gas. She's had her life, she continued, apparently unable to stop herself. She's old, she's alone, she doesn't contribute anything anymore. That house is wasted on her. We could make it beautiful, we could raise children there, we could actually use it the way it deserves to be used. Sarah let the words hang in the air before reaching over and clicking off the recorder. I think we have everything we need, she said. The legal proceedings moved quickly after that. Restraining orders were issued and served. Eviction notices were filed and executed. Within a week, they were out of my house and legally prohibited from contacting me without going through my attorney. My son tried to call, tried to apologize, tried to explain that he'd been confused, manipulated, led astray. But some lines, once crossed, can't be uncrossed. Some words, once spoken, can't be taken back. Some actions, once taken, change everything forever. I stood in my house again for the first time in 2 months, breathing in the familiar smell of lemon oil and vanilla candles, running my hands over surfaces I'd polished and protected for decades. It looked different somehow, not because anything had changed, but because I had changed. The house was still beautiful, still filled with memories, still worth fighting for. But it was no longer the center of my universe. I considered selling it, moving closer to Margaret, starting fresh somewhere without ghosts and painful memories. But that would be letting them win, letting them drive me from the home Harold and I had built together. Instead, I decided to stay, but on my own terms. I had the locks changed again, better ones this time, with security systems and cameras. I updated my will, creating a trust that would ensure the house would never fall into the wrong hands. I designated Margaret as my backup decision-maker, gave her power of attorney, made sure that if anything happened to me, there would be people who actually loved me making decisions about my life and my property. Most importantly, I stopped trying to be the mother my son wanted me to be and started being the person I needed to be. I joined a support group for elder abuse survivors, started volunteering at a legal aid clinic that helped other seniors navigate similar situations. I began writing down my story, documenting not just what happened, but how it felt, how the manipulation worked, how easy it was to doubt myself even when I was right. My new routine included daily walks on the beach when I visited Margaret, weekly therapy sessions to process the trauma and betrayal, monthly meetings with my lawyer to review my legal protections. I made new friends, people who valued my wisdom instead of my assets, who appreciated my company instead of calculating my net worth. The hardest part wasn't the legal battle or the financial stress or even the public humiliation. The hardest part was accepting that the son I'd raised, the boy I'd loved unconditionally, had chosen someone else's approval over my welfare. That the child I'd protected and nurtured and sacrificed for had become someone willing to push me, to humiliate me, to gaslight me into giving up everything I'd worked for. But I learned something important in those dark months. Family isn't just about blood. Family is about who shows up when you're vulnerable. Family is about who protects your dignity instead of exploiting your love. Family is about who guards your interests instead of calculating how to benefit from your death. Margaret was family. Sarah, My lawyer who fought for me like I was her own mother was family. The neighbors who testified about what they'd witnessed, the friends who stood by me despite the social media smear campaign, the therapist who helped me rebuild my sense of self-worth, they were all more family to me than the son who shared my DNA, but not my values. I still live in my house. I still tend my garden, still polish Harold's chandelier, still bake lemon cake on special occasions. But I don't bake it for people who see me as an obstacle to their dreams. I don't open my home to people who view my possessions as their inheritance. I don't offer my love to people who mistake kindness for weakness. My son sends cards sometimes on my birthday, at Christmas, on the anniversary of Harold's death. They're always signed by both of them, always include some version of, "We hope you're well," always stop just short of actual apology. I don't respond. Some wounds are too deep for greeting cards to heal. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt with good intentions and awkward pleasantries. Self-preservation isn't selfishness. Protecting yourself from people who want to harm you isn't cruel, even when those people are related to you. Generosity without boundaries doesn't feed the hungry. It feeds the vultures, the predators, the people who see your kindness as their opportunity. I learned that love isn't about sacrifice without limits. Real love is about mutual respect, about protecting each other's dignity, about building each other up instead of tearing each other down. Real love doesn't push. Real love doesn't manipulate. Real love doesn't demand that you give up everything that matters to you to prove your devotion. If this story gave you strength, if it helped you recognize patterns in your own life, if it reminded you that you have value beyond what you can provide to other people, then it was worth telling. If you've faced something similar, if you're facing something similar right now, please know that you're not alone. You're not crazy. You're not selfish for wanting to keep what you've earned, for protecting what you've built, for saying no to people who want to take advantage of your love. Your home is your sanctuary. Your assets are your security. Your dignity is your birthright. Never let anyone convince you that you have to give up any of those things to prove your worth. Never let anyone push you, literally or figuratively, and then blame you for falling down. You matter. Your life matters. Your choices matter. And you have every right to live in your own house, in your own way, for as long as you choose to do so. That's not selfishness. That's survival. That's self-respect. That's exactly what love looks like when it's directed at yourself instead of people who don't deserve it. The waves still crash against the rocks outside Margaret's window. The lemon tree in my backyard still blooms every spring. Harold's chandelier still catches the morning light like scattered diamonds. And I'm still here, still standing, still protecting what matters most, not just my house or my money, but my right to exist on my own terms, with my dignity intact and my boundaries respected. That's what victory looks like when you're fighting for your soul. Not conquest, but conservation. Not domination, but dignity. Not revenge, but the simple, powerful act of refusing to disappear to make other people's lives more convenient. I'm still here. I'm still fighting. I'm still worthy of love that doesn't cost me everything I am. And so are you.